Ever wondered, like, why you're drawn to certain faces?
Yeah.
Or why some features just seem, I don't know, attractive?
It's fascinating.
Yeah. Today, we're going to dive deep into the evolutionary roots of attraction. We're going to really unpack the science behind what we find appealing in a potential partner.
Yeah, we're basically looking at this whole evolutionary theory of sexual attraction. How do physical and even some non-physical cues act as signals? Things like health, fertility, mate quality, that sort of thing.
Yeah. And we're not just making this up. We've actually dug into a ton of scientific articles looking at the psychology, the biology, all the nitty-gritty of attraction.
Exactly. We've got the
We
receipts.
do. And our goal today is to help you guys understand these key evolutionary principles that are at play when it comes to attraction. And you might be surprised by some of the things we found. For instance, you might think perfect symmetry is like the ultimate sign of beauty, health, good genes. But the science is a little more complicated than that.
Yeah, it's not that simple. And actually, let's talk about that right now. This idea that a perfectly symmetrical face is somehow like a beacon of health, it might not be as straightforward as we think.
Okay, so elaborate on that a little bit.
Sure. So there was a study, they looked at over 300 teenagers. They were all 17 years old. And they measured their facial symmetry very, very precisely.
Wow, so they really got in there with the rulers, huh?
Yeah, pretty much. But here's the thing, they found no direct connection between that perfect symmetry and their actual developmental health scores.
Really? That's so interesting. And it's not like it was a tiny study, right?
No, it was a pretty big sample size. And there was another study, even bigger, over 4,700 15-year-olds in Britain. And they did the same thing, really detailed 3D scans of their faces to measure symmetry.
So high-tech rulers this time.
Exactly. And again, they found that facial symmetry didn't really predict how healthy those kids were when they were younger.
So two big studies, both saying symmetry isn't a clear sign of perfect health. So then, why do we still find symmetrical faces attractive?
Well, one theory is that it might be more about what we call developmental stability. Like a symmetrical face suggests that someone grew up without any major hiccups, no big genetic problems, no huge environmental stressors.
Okay, so their journey to adulthood was relatively smooth. Their face reflects that.
Right. But, that direct link to measurable health outcomes, maybe not so clear cut. Then there's this other study from Latvia that throws another wrench in things.
Oh, this is where it gets really interesting.
They were looking at young men, and they found a link between their family's income when they were kids and their immune function as young adults.
So wealthier families, healthier immune systems.
Seems that way. But here's the kicker. They also found a connection between immune function and facial asymmetry.
So less money, more asymmetry, weaker immune system.
Yeah, in this particular group, that's what they saw. Which kind of suggests that maybe facial features and health, it's not a universal thing. Maybe it's influenced by where you grew up, your environment.
It's like your face is telling a story about your life, not just your genes.
Exactly. And that makes you wonder, are we drawn to someone because their face screams healthy right now? Or is it more about their whole developmental history, which might hint at health?
It's like our brains are trying to decode all these subtle clues.
Right. It's complex. But okay, let's move on from symmetry because there's a lot more to talk about.
Yeah, let's dive into some other facial features that we zero in on when we're checking someone out.
So in terms of evolutionary signals, something called sexual dimorphism is key. That just means the physical differences between men and women.
Right, like men tend to be taller, women have wider hips, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And when it comes to faces, features that are linked to higher estrogen levels in women, things like fuller lips, softer jawline, those are seen as attractive. And then there's the waist-to-hip ratio, or WHR.
And that's all about curves, right?
Yeah, basically. A WHR of about 0.7, that means your waist is about 70% of your hip circumference. That's considered very attractive across cultures.
And there's a reason for that, right? It's not just some arbitrary preference.
Nope, not at all. It's directly tied to fertility. A lower WHR usually means a woman has a better hormonal profile for reproduction.
Oh, I remember reading about this study. It was done at a fertility clinic.
Yeah, for every 0.1 increase in a woman's WHR, their chance of getting pregnant in a cycle dropped by a whopping 30%. That's huge.
Wow, that's really powerful evidence. And it makes you think about how, what's considered ideal for women's bodies, it often reflects these biological signals, even if people aren't consciously aware of it.
Definitely. And it's not just about waist and hips. Breasts play a role too, of course.
Huh.
Size, shape, symmetry, firmness. They all contribute to how attractive someone is perceived.
So bigger is better.
Well, generally speaking, medium to larger breasts tend to be seen as more attractive, healthier, younger, more fertile. It might be because they signal higher levels of estradiol, which, like we said, is linked to fertility.
And I remember reading something about the specific shape being important too.
Yeah, the ratio between the upper and lower parts of the breast. If it's about 45.55, slightly fuller at the bottom, and firm and symmetrical, that's considered attractive.
So a lot of factors at play there. Now, what about men's faces, specifically masculinity? Because that seems like a trickier topic.
It is. There's this idea, the immunocompetence handicap hypothesis. Basically, it says that really masculine features, which come from testosterone, might actually weaken the immune system a bit.
So like a trade-off. You get the strong jawline, but maybe you're more likely to get sick.
Kind of. The idea is that only really healthy guys can afford to spend resources on developing those masculine traits and still have a good immune system. But when we look at what women actually find attractive in men's faces, the research is all over the place. Some studies show a preference for masculine faces, some don't. It even seems to change depending on things like the environment, disease prevalence, even where a woman is in her cycle.
Oh yeah, that whole menstrual cycle thing, that's a whole debate in itself, right?
Yeah, some research says women like more masculine features when they're fertile, but other studies disagree. It's not a settled issue.
So lots of complexity there.
Yeah.
Now let's shift gears a little bit. We've talked about long-term stuff like developmental history and genetics. What about cues that signal someone's health right now in this moment?
So one really cool thing is that we can actually judge someone's body mass index, or BMI, pretty accurately just by looking at their face. And faces with a healthy BMI tend to be rated as more attractive.
So not too thin, not too heavy, just right.
Exactly. And it's not just a guess. There are these high-tech methods, geometric morphometrics, where they can measure the shape of your face and predict your BMI, blood pressure, body fat percentage, all that.
Seriously. That's amazing. It's like our faces are betraying all our secrets.
Pretty much. And skin plays a big role, too. People tend to prefer lighter, redder, and slightly yellower skin.
Redness makes sense, healthy blood flow,
Yeah.
right? But lighter and yellower.
So the redness probably does signal good circulation. The yellowness might be about carotenoids. Those are pigments we get from fruits and veggies, linked to good health. And lightness can be seen as youthful and healthy in some contexts.
Okay, so we've covered development, long-term potential, current health. What about cues that hint at someone's genes, their genetic quality? Because that's a big deal, evolutionarily speaking.
Absolutely. One area of research is the major histocompatibility complex, or MHC. These are genes involved in your immune system. The idea is that we might be drawn to people with different MHC genes than our own.
Because variety is the spice of life.
Right.
At least when it comes to genes.
Exactly. The theory is that if you mate with someone who has different MHC genes, your kids will have a more diverse immune system, making them more resistant to diseases.
And wasn't there a study with smelly t-shirts that looked at this?
Oh, yeah, the classic t-shirt sniffing study. People rated the attractiveness of t-shirts worn by others. And some studies did find that we prefer the scent of people with different MHC genes. But when you combine the results of many studies, the evidence is mixed.
So no magic sniff test for genetic compatibility then. What about something more straightforward, like height? That seems to matter a lot, especially for men.
Yeah, male height is interesting. Studies show a link between height and intelligence. About 71% of it is genetic. And taller men often earn more money. But it's not always taller is better. The relationship between height and reproductive success might be curvilinear.
Meaning there's a sweet spot, like
Yeah.
being too tall or too short might be a disadvantage.
Exactly. Now, let's talk about muscles, because that's another big visual cue, especially in men.
Yeah, muscles equal strength, right, which is
Yeah.
attractive.
Right. Men naturally have more muscle mass than women. But the research on how much muscle is most attractive, it's a bit mixed. Some studies say moderate muscle is best. Others say perceived strength is key. It probably depends on what qualities people are looking for in a mate.
It seems like for a lot of these features, there's a just right amount. Not too much, not too little. Now let's get into something a bit different. Do our faces reveal anything about our personalities? And does that affect how attractive we find someone?
This is fascinating. There's evidence that we can actually pick up on some personality traits just by looking at someone's face. And we tend to find faces of people with desirable traits more attractive.
So if someone is generally agreeable, their face might reflect that, and we'll subconsciously pick up on it.
Potentially, yes. People are surprisingly good at judging things like extroversion, agreeableness, even emotional stability just from a photo.
Wow, that's really cool. It's like our personalities shape our appearance over time.
It's complex, but there's definitely something there. But it's important to remember that behavior is a much better indicator of personality than just a face. You get a first impression from a face, but you really need to see how someone acts to know who they are.
Makes sense. You can't judge a book by its cover, but the cover might give you some hints. So we've talked about faces and bodies. What about things that aren't actually part of our bodies? Those can play a role in attraction too, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Things like status symbols, possessions, they can signal things like wealth, resources, even personality traits that aren't visible. For example, there was this study where they showed women photos of men. Some men were sitting in a fancy Bentley, others in a regular Ford Fiesta.
Okay, I can guess where this is going.
The men in the Bentley were rated as way more attractive.
No surprise there. But what if it was the other way around? Women with fancy cars or apartments?
They actually tested that too, but didn't work the same way. Men didn't find women in a luxury apartment any more attractive than women in a normal apartment.
Interesting. So men might care more about those status symbols than women do.
It seems that way. And it kind of fits with the evolutionary idea that women might prioritize men who can provide resources.
Yeah, makes sense. And I remember reading about the foodie calls study.
Ah, yes, that one. It was controversial, but it found that 33% of women admitted to going on dates just for a free meal.
So resources definitely matter. And it's not always about material things, right? Creativity can be attractive too.
Absolutely. Especially for men, being creative, like in visual arts, can be a signal of mate quality. There was a study that showed that men's success in art predicted how many partners they'd had.
So that whole starving artist thing, maybe there's some truth to it. They might not have money, but they have something else going for them.
Right. The art as sexual display theory says that men might use art to show off their skills and genes, basically saying, look what I can do.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from facial symmetry to body shape to cars and art. What are the big takeaways you'd want our listeners to remember about the evolutionary roots of attraction?
Well, the main thing is that attraction is not random. It's a biological mechanism that helps us find good mates. The things we find attractive, whether it's physical features or possessions, they often signal things like health, fertility, good genes, the ability to provide.
So it's not just about what looks nice, that's about what signals good potential for a partner.
Exactly. And we need to remember that there's a difference between cultural trends and personal tastes, which change all the time, and these deeper evolutionary preferences for traits that really signal quality in a mate.
Right, some things are just hardwired into us. But the science is complex, right? What we think is attractive doesn't always line up with what the research shows.
Yeah, there are nuances and sometimes even conflicting findings. It's not always simple.
And the amazing thing is that even in our modern world, these ancient evolutionary cues still matter.
Oh, absolutely. Even with all our technology and social changes, these biological drives are still shaping who we find attractive and who we choose as partners.
It's fascinating, really. So as you go about your day, think about this. When you're attracted to someone, how much of that is driven by these deep evolutionary signals we've been talking about? And how much is it influenced by the world around you? Your culture, the media, your personal experiences?
Yeah, think about that interplay. Because understanding these underlying mechanisms can really change how you see human relationships.
Absolutely. Well, we've only scratched the surface of this topic. If you're interested in learning more, definitely check out the studies we mentioned. There's so much more to explore.
Yeah, dive deeper. You might be surprised by what you find.